All right, well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for your patience while I stood behind the stage wrapping this headset around my head. So, one of the things we know about technology and technology for tomorrow and for a changing world is eventually we will find headsets and microphones that work seamlessly for men and for women with all of our hair. So let's just talk about that as the beginning of this. I would like to say thank you to everybody here in Warsaw for the incredibly warm welcome that you have provided MIT. MIT talks about itself as an institution that is sort of in the world for the world. And we are not an ivory tower. We don't just like to sit in our, cement and concrete corridors, which I must say look a little bit familiar here with large classrooms, and just talk to one another. We absolutely want to get out into the world, mostly because we want to understand the most interesting problems and challenges that are really ours to solve. And so this is a wonderful opportunity for us to come and to learn from you, and to also bring some of our experiences to all of you. But particularly at these really interesting and I think complicated geopolitical times, there's nothing more important than actually getting out beyond the walls of our campus, beyond Massachusetts, beyond the United States, across the Atlantic to Europe, and particularly here, right in Central and Eastern Europe. It's absolutely essential for us that we do that. And I just also want to give a very, very special thank you to all the students from MIT and all of our volunteers who've been organizing this. They've already talked to you about their enthusiasm. One of the things you might not realize, and I'm the professor of quite a lot of these students, is really how hard we make them work during the semester. And several of them who are in my class right now, I can tell you, Dominic, I'm not sure where you are, but there you are, Dominic. All of you seem to have been able to carry on with your homework and all the other things. So well done. I mean, that takes an awful lot of dedication and commitment. So I'm really pleased about that. Now, one of my jobs here is to bring a little bit of MIT to all of you. And it's quite bold and dangerous on the parts of the students to ask an MIT professor to stand up and give a lecture, because most of us do that for either 90 minutes, sometimes for, 3 hours. We sometimes lecture for a day. With my colleague, Dr. Phil Budden, I've just been teaching our executive MBA students for a week. And so you're in for a treat. I'm not sure how long. I think they told me, did you say 3 hours? Is that what we're looking for? Not sure. Anyway, here's what we're going to do. I want to talk about geopolitics and what that means for entrepreneurs, because I don't think that we can ignore the geopolitical landscape as we think about and try to understand the role that all of you entrepreneurs play. I think it's extremely important for us to talk about the significant challenges that we face today. These global challenges are of growing importance, and I think that I personally like to bucket them into three. So the first is sort of climate instability and energy resilience. Nothing is more important in a sense, and we've seen this with the invasion of Ukraine, of the resilience of our energy systems. We also need to think about healthcare. COVID reminded us of the importance of healthcare, pandemic, the health burden. And then centrally and increasingly, we can't think about this world and the future of the planet and the world that we inhabit if we don't think about defense and security. This is on the front page of every major newspaper, is how are we going to secure the world that we inhabit for ourselves, for all of you as the next generation, and for our children and our children's children. And this, I think, is an essential responsibility, actually, of entrepreneurs today. Now, we see what we would call deep tech as absolutely essential technologies that are going to be changing the world around us. And when we say deep tech, we really do mean technologies that lie at the frontier of science and engineering. And that might be, things like advanced manufacturing, advanced materials, autonomy, compute, semiconductors, robotics, I mean, you name it. But we really are asking the question, are these the right solutions? Is this what really matters? Now, I think the previous decades have often been decades of software. They've been decades of ones and zeros. But today, those ones and zeros aren't enough. If we could solve all of our problems with software, we would, actually, because it's much more capital efficient. We can develop it more rapidly. But that really isn't enough. And so, when we think about the kinds of solutions that matter, we absolutely have to combine the digital world with the material world. And that, I think, is the enormous solution set, if you like, in the tapestry of solutions that we have available to us. Now, the idea of deep tech is actually not new. You can look at every single century and ask, was it steam power? Was it the chemical processing revolution of the 19th century? was it really the semiconductor revolution that we had in the middle of the 20th century. And so this is not a new idea, but it is, I think, of growing importance. And it's of such importance that, in fact, most nations today have lists of what they might call priority critical technologies. NATO and the work that I do with colleagues here like Patrick and others have a list of what they call emerging and disruptive technologies, EDTs. And so every nation has decided that some of these technologies are absolutely essential to our future. And so each nation has what I can only describe as a kind of wish list of the technologies that they particularly want. And so we really have to think through, how are we going to access these things? And how do we do that not just as individual nations, but how do we do that as a collective? How does Europe tap into these deep technological foundations? Now, the thing that many countries today have recognized, and the reason they have their own particular lists, is because sovereignty has re-emerged, I think, as a very central part of the debate. And this idea of economic security, that is, economic prosperity meets national security, is, in these very turbulent geopolitical times, seen as something that is centrally important. So that means, can we control the underlying technological foundations of our economies so that we have the kind of latitude of action to protect ourselves as countries? And again, we understand this in the context of the sort of great power competition between the US and China, but it's impossible for us to ignore the fact that these are questions that European nations need to answer. And I say European in the broader sense to include my country, the United Kingdom, regardless of whether it's a member of the European Union. But across Europe, we have to ask these questions. And frankly, we have to make sure that we think about this as a collective. I don't think it's enough for each country. It's so inefficient for each country to do this alone. But as entrepreneurs, we want to tap into the wider European strengths and opportunities. Again, this idea of sovereignty is not actually new. I've been reading quite a lot about sort of the history of deep technology and sort of and this idea of sovereign control over technologies. And there's some extraordinary stories about these things, often on the edge or the brink of war, frankly, reminding us of this. So right before World War I, just as it was breaking out, the British blockaded Chile. And you might say, why on earth were they doing that? They were blockading Chile to stop Germany, that at the time was, of course, on the other side of the conflict, because they basically wanted to block access to saltpeter. And you might say, what on earth is that? Why do we need that? That was the source of fertilizer, which allowed us to have food security. And it was also the source of explosives, of TNT, which allowed us to have the defense technology that sadly we needed. Now, when we blockaded, all of a sudden, what happened, the Germans actually looked for alternatives and invented all those synthetic substitutes, the Haber-Bosch process that the chemists like me in the audience might remember learning in some of those early chemistry lectures that you get. And so this idea of wanting sovereign control over the sources of technology, and particularly deep tech, whether that's based on chemical sciences, physical sciences, biological sciences, is again a rather old idea. But the thing that we've been thinking about is what makes this new and how do we think about this today? Well, I think the rationale for sovereign control has come absolutely front and center. It's something that we observe on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. During COVID, we saw this when we thought about the supply chains and our access to COVID vaccines. Countries that were able to develop those vaccines, but also actually develop the entire process, were able to have much more significant ability to shape their own outcomes. Countries that had alliances and partnerships that could build those collective outcomes also found that easier. We see this with communications. If I'm sitting in Ukraine and I'm reliant upon Starlink, that puts my world in a very different situation than if I had a different sort of access to communications technology, if I had much more distributed access to technology. And so technologies shape the outcomes of individuals, it shapes the outcomes of nations. And again, we see this with things like drone technology. And one of the things that I think this sort of transformation is doing is reminding us that it's not enough to have ingenuity. Right? It's not enough, actually, to develop the early stages of ideas, to patent things, to have inventions. We actually have to worry about and understand and shape how we scale those technologies, how we access global supply chains, what those things might look like. And I think we have an opportunity to basically reconstruct a very resilient industrial base all across Europe, taking advantage of the comparative expertise of different countries, of some of the expertise at scale in places like Poland, how we might think about partnering collectively to do this. And so as entrepreneurs, we suddenly have to learn about resilient supply chains, resilient production scale in ways that were not part of the entrepreneurial conversation only a few years ago. And so you might think about this in terms of drones. I won't sort of go into extraordinary detail, although I'd be very happy to. People have really worried about whether or not they can actually make drones at scale in Ukraine. Can they access the supply chain of the key inputs? The United States is worried about this when a startup company like Skydio suddenly found that its access to critical components was blocked. And so I did some work recently, which is published in Tech Review, where we basically took apart, imagine putting a drone on an operating table, taking it apart, and kind of asking, what's the anatomy? What are the key components? And you can see this list of components down the middle: brushless motors, who knew? Propellers, cameras, antenna. And we asked ourselves, if you were trying to build one of these drones today, where would you have to go to get every single one of those components? And as you can see, the country of manufacture today is largely China, with a very small handful available in the US and Europe. And the next question we asked is this inevitable? Is that where all these things were invented? And you might not be surprised to know that the answer is no, not inevitable. If you look on the left-hand side, you'll see the technology origin: the US, Japan, Europe, Russia, UK. So you can see that most of these ideas were actually invented in other parts of the world, but they were perfected at scale in a country that had massive and has huge comparative advantage in supply chains. And when the world is peaceful, and I think we will look back on the past 20, 50 years as an unusually peaceful period, then it makes sense for us to tap into global comparative advantage, to build global supply chains and global manufacturing. But today it's not quite so peaceful. It is fragmented by geopolitics. And so we really do have to ask ourselves, while we have built a huge dependency on China for manufacturing and specialization, is that what the future holds? And might we think differently about building and rebuilding a more resilient industrial base, which is an entrepreneurial act that's going to be hugely important for entrepreneurs all across Europe, and frankly in the United States as well. So I see this as a project for all of us thinking about entrepreneurship and building companies. And so you might say, well, all right, how is all this different? Why are entrepreneurs doing this work in deep tech? If we wound the clock back again 20, 25 years, really what we saw is deep tech being developed in large organizations, often in fields. So we talk about greenfield sites, we talk about ivory towers, and most nations would have tapped into major national labs if they were doing huge and important strategic and geostrategic projects. And so in the United States, they might have been doing the Manhattan Project or NASA in a field somewhere in a large open space. In Britain, we relied on Bletchley Park to do all that code breaking during the war. We relied on large corporations like Bell Labs and Xerox PARC and others to do this. And universities mattered, but really to provide the underlying talent. And I think the transformation we see today, that all of you are part of, is that the deepest of deep technology is now not just being developed in the corridors of these large, extraordinary organizations, but it's being developed in the hands of entrepreneurs. And if we ever needed proof or evidence that that's true, you can really look no further than a company that spun out of MIT in around 2015, which is Commonwealth Fusion. Commonwealth Fusion Systems is a very, very significant company that was based on fusion energy research, funded for over 30 years by the US Department of Energy in our Plasma Science and Fusion Center. If any of you have been to campus, you'll see this down in a sort of rather uninspiring small brick building on the west end of campus. But a lot of work. And then all of a sudden, all the funding goes to one of these major greenfield sites. It went to ITER, which is, I have to look at this, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. Now, that doesn't sound like a very fun thing, but I will tell you it's in the south of France. So it's in a beautiful, sunny location, but all the government money has been poured into a single project. And some of the entrepreneurs at MIT, some of the entrepreneurs in other fusion research centers around the world said, hold on a minute. We think that there's an entrepreneurial opportunity. We think fusion is no longer always 30 years away and has been for 30 years. We think there's an opportunity to drive risk capital into this, that we think we've taken the science risk out. Now we're solving for engineering problems. All the work and all the opportunity actually that advanced compute gives us to basically do simulation makes it easier for us, more capital efficient. And so Commonwealth Fusion Systems was born by a group of postdoc staff and professors who spun out of MIT. Now, they have raised, talk about risk capital, they've raised a lot of risk capital, but in a very, very structured way. Now, that's an extreme case, and as a sort of engineer and scientist, I like to think about what we would call the asymptotic case, like what's the extreme? But let's use that to inform the fact that we can do this in lots of instances. We see this in something like SpaceX, in Helsing, in Moderna, in BioNTech, you name it. We can now do deep tech in the hands of startups. And so what we're seeing, I think, is many of these deep tech ventures teams are starting to take this idea very seriously, of using deep tech to solve some of these really big and significant challenges. And in the work that we've been doing at the NATO Innovation Fund, we've been absolutely seeing these kinds of companies, not just in the US, but also all over Europe. And we're beginning to see and find these teams and these individuals co-locating in places that we call innovation ecosystems. These places that are very deep, sort of dense collections of humans who sort of share a willingness and ability to experiment, to try new things. And again, people might have said, look, this is a Silicon Valley phenomenon. Okay, maybe it's also a Boston phenomenon, but it's not for us. That's definitely not the case. We see burgeoning, vibrant innovation ecosystems all across Europe. And whether we see them in Munich or Oxford or Copenhagen or here in Warsaw, we're beginning to see incredibly vibrant innovation ecosystems. And not just focused on digital technology, although that's important, but also increasingly focused on deep tech. And for me, this is a huge source of hope and opportunity. Now, to be successful, what we know is that entrepreneurs have to work with other stakeholders. And you might say, what do I mean? Who are these stakeholders? These are the people who have resources. They have resources that they can bring to bear to basically think about, and sort of pull together the sort of expertise, the infrastructure, the capital, the talent, and so on that you might need in your ecosystem. And so I think what you'll see here in our various panels are people from these different stakeholder groups talking about how they're going to contribute. I see sort of colleagues from the local university, from the University of Warsaw here. So the universities matter. The government actually matters. Again, the Silicon Valley narrative is that government should get out of the way. I think they've changed their mind at the moment. They've decided they're going to go to the government. That's a slightly separate conversation, but nonetheless, the government has a very important role to play. So do large corporations. And as an aspiring entrepreneur, we might say, what do you need to ask of your stakeholders? What do you want from them? And what we know is that really you need to insist on those organizations stepping up and providing the talented people that you need. They need to step up and provide some of the specialized capital that is so important to your growth. We need to make sure that we are providing some of the specialized infrastructure so that the cost for you to experiment and grow goes down. And the lead customers, Bogi mentioned this before, will our governments not only spend more on resilience, on defense and security, on health, on energy, but will they spend it with startups? It's not enough to just say we'll spend more money. We've got to A, spend it, we've got to spend it well, and we have to spend it with our entrepreneurial startups so that we build and drive those innovation ecosystems. Now, given that there are a number of you in this room who are entrepreneurs, I thought that I should talk a little bit about money, because risk capital is what is on most of your minds. As Bogi said, people say there's never enough of it. That's probably true. We also do know that some of the most overfunded projects, the ones that go horribly wrong because there's no discipline of how you use the money. But the data suggests that deep tech ventures are now actually a quite significant recipient of venture capital. And we think, and this is based on a whole bunch of different analysis, and it depends on your precise definition, but probably around 20% of risk capital is going to deep tech, particularly if we include therapeutics in that. So that's about $100 billion a year. Now, that's the good news. The middling news, let me call it, is that that is still dominated by the US. So at least 46, 50 billion of that is going to the US. But the good news is that more and more of that is going to Europe. And that number has been growing at a much more significant rate than we see in the rest of the world. And so US investment is about 2.5 times European, but in Europe that means almost $20 billion annually going into deep tech. That's an extraordinary opportunity. And it's an opportunity that NATO Innovation Fund and others, and many of you here in this room who are risk capital providers are really trying to kind of amplify. It's also true that this money is not just going into a few areas. It's not just going into healthcare and life sciences, which is perhaps the traditional path. These are some crazy charts. These mostly come from Deal Room. And so trying to one of the difficulties of deep tech is everyone defines it a little differently. But if you look at how it breaks down, on the left-hand side, you can see the kinds of things that people were trying to do. Hydrogen, nuclear, rockets, quantum computing. And if you look on the right, the very specific kinds of technology, obviously a lot in AI. And again, I would argue that AI is increasingly becoming a little bit more of a digital technology if we decouple it from the compute and so on, but nonetheless, very important. But we're beginning to see hardware, big data, biotech, blockchain, nano, all the usual deep tech buzzwords. It's not evenly distributed across Europe. We know that, at least at the moment, the UK is getting an outsized share of this money, but we're beginning to see the flows, in a sense, flowing eastwards and southwards from the UK, Germany, France, definitely into Eastern Europe. We're seeing all kinds of interesting things here in Poland, in Estonia, in the Nordics, and particularly in areas like defense and security. What I will say is that a lot of this is focused on the universities. And so if you look at, there's some quite nice numbers and things coming, again, from Deal Room and our friends at Lakestar, where they're basically asking which of the universities that are accounting for some of the leading edge of deep tech. They're using AI as a proxy, but this looks about right? ETH in Zurich, Imperial in the UK, Oxford, let's see, our friends at EPFL, and so on. I prefer the map, but I think this map, and I apologize, needs to go further east. We're going to have to redraw one of our own, so we include what's really going on here. But what we see is locations particularly like this, where you might not have the largest amount of capital, but you're beginning to increasingly specialize that capital on some of those areas of massive comparative advantage. And we have those here in Europe and in our particular nations. Quantum computing, some of the interface of deep tech and health, space tech, climate, actually some of the themes of technologies for this changing world that we were just talking about. And here is where Europe seems to be building its comparative advantage. And I want to pull out just one sector in particular, which is space. Space, I think, is particularly interesting and important because it is, of course, both commercial and defense and security. It is absolutely a classic dual-use technology. And we see in all these extraordinary details, and so Europe here is the blue bar, and this is what is the fraction of global money being spent. And look, Europe is spending a lot on its startups and investing in mission planning and semiconductors for space and communication and connectivity. Really interesting. And how important is that for sovereignty? Our ability as European nations to actually control our own destiny and to actually become prosperous at the same time. And so I just wanted to pick out a few of the companies that I think are so interesting. ESA Aerospace is in Munich. It's a space launch company, Space Forge in the UK, but Orbital Matter here in Poland, ISI up in Finland, but I think with a presence here. And so, again, we see this as something that's being distributed across Europe in some very, very interesting ways. And so the real question we have to ask is, I think, how do we do this in a collective fashion? What does it mean for us as entrepreneurs, as those supporting members of the ecosystem, to actually take geopolitics seriously and think about it as an opportunity for gathering capital from across different boundaries, for thinking about opportunities that come from European sovereignty? And so this question about Europe needing shared defense capabilities is something that my colleague Lars and I have written about. The Americans have talked about small yards with high fences, which means there's a small set of things that they want to do just for themselves. I think that yard is growing at the moment in the United States. And that leaves an opportunity, I believe, for Europe to build what we would call shared gardens. So how do we share in collective capabilities that take advantage of our comparative strengths, country by country, entrepreneur by entrepreneur? I promised I'd tell you that entrepreneurs, it's not all about you. You don't have to do everything yourself. In these growing ecosystems, what an opportunity you have to work with these other stakeholders. But we need the universities to step up. We're working on this at MIT. We are by no means perfect. But we need to educate the next generation of MBAs, of PhD students, of technical students, with business students, to absolutely generate these companies. That's still a work in progress. We still teach entrepreneurship as if we're just doing software. We have to teach this and engage ideas from the lab to impact, not just the dorm to impact. We need our large corporations to tap into deep tech startups, and I've written some about this, and we see this with deep tech VC increasingly including corporate participation. Those of you in large companies, you are hugely important as partners, not just your money, but your expertise. And lastly, the government. As Bogi said, it's not enough, as the economist says here, to spend more on defense, not just to pretend to. And it's not just defense. It's spending money on energy resilience, on health. We've got to start to buy smartly from startups. You've got to be able to get efficient contracts from the government and so on. And so now I think is perhaps one of the most important moments for entrepreneurs. We used to be able to teach a class in entrepreneurship and never mention politics or geopolitics, but today that's not possible. We would not be doing our job if we didn't say you have to confront the reality of where the money is coming from, where the infrastructure can be accessed, who do you get contracts from, how do you build resilient manufacturing at scale, how do you think about supply chains? You've got to start as entrepreneurs to be geopolitically savvy from the day that you begin your companies. That's actually, I think, an exciting time and a huge opportunity, but it's an added challenge that's going to require even more of that grit and determination that we talk about. And so I think what I would just say is I do believe that it's more important than ever to think about the geopolitical context, to kind of use it to your advantage as countries start to buy more, to really think about driving capital and opportunity into their particular nations. You want to make sure your ideas have the most significant impact, and I believe this is how you do it. And the last thing I think I would say is, of course, geopolitics is on all the headlines that we see here. And of course, we see it on the news every day, and we see pronouncements coming from government leaders. But I think the real opportunity, particularly at these difficult times, has to do with individuals. And so the very fact that we're all here together from either side of the Atlantic, from across Europe, is what really gives me significant hope that in times of, I think, real geopolitical complexity and fracture, it's the human networks that are actually going to hold us together. And it's those personal relationships and networks that bridge entrepreneurs and build that resilient entrepreneurial community that I really do believe will make a difference. And so with that, I just want to thank you again for having me, and I look forward to the rest of the few days here together. Thank you very much. Thank you.